Today, I just want to chat with you about my personal journey in philosophy and what it's meant for me and how perhaps it has changed me. Now, one of the first things that happened when I started reading philosophy is I realized how little I know. Now, this is an important step because then it creates this desire for more knowledge. And then when I realized how little I know, I then started to sort of read about other subjects, topics, uh, uh, namely science. And science is an extremely wide field. For instance, in difficult subjects like, for instance, quantum physics, um, my knowledge, my scientific knowledge, is not really good enough to understand the mechanics of quantum physics. But what I realized is that if I read about the history of quantum physics, I can get a very good idea of what it's about, what is the importance and significance of quantum physics, and where it fits in with our life on Earth. Um, and it's important to also mention that one of the second things that I learned in philosophy is that everything is connected. So uh, it's important to try and understand as much as you can. And for me as a layperson to say, well, I can't understand quantum physics, let me just push it to the side, I thought that is not, that's not on. So I then started to read about the history of quantum physics, and that helped me a lot. So I then realized the value of reading about the history of something. And I did a similar thing with most other topics. And I started to realize that if you start reading about the history of, for instance, simple things, money, uh, economy, politics, philosophy, science, of course, history, religion. Th- if you start reading about the history of those topics, then it's very much easier to understand how everything fits in together. You don't have to study um, science and be a boffin on science. If you study the history of science, that will take you a very long way. The study of the history of religion, for instance, now that for me was very interesting, eye opener, in fact. And I must say, it's something that almost made me angry because uh, I realized how little believers even know about the history of their own religion that they are now putting so much faith on. Um, but in any event, the history of philosophy is another thing. Now, if you want to study philosophy and want to know more about philosophy, because philosophy is such a wide field, it can take you a long, long time. In fact, it took me about 5 years just to find my feet in philosophy. And it's not that I'm saying I'm a philosopher after 5 years. It's just that I felt comfortable in philosophy. Even now, after 15, 20 years, I'm not sure how long, reading philosophy, I'm not presenting myself as a philosopher. I'm just doing this channel basically um, because I think that philosophy, the value of it, there are many lessons that we can learn from reading philosophy, and for me, it's very problematic, troubling that philosophy is sort of not even regarded as important all over the world, really. Because the lessons of philosophy, I think, it's very important. And let me just give you an example. Um, in the primitive times, when people still believed in spirits and so on, obviously they did not really question their world in a critical way. Um, And then it developed from that to people starting to believe in many gods. This is now basically in Egypt and in Greece. Uh, and only later did people start believing in a single God in the West now. But in in Greek times, the classical Greek philosophers' time, it's about, I don't know, 500 BC. Those philosophers, they were the first people to really critically look at life on Earth and asking questions, and trying to study something. And they promoted this idea that knowledge is extremely important. The truth of a particular thing is very important, and that to get to the truth, it's important to also use reason and logic. Now, that is almost how many years ago? 3,000 years ago, and still we are struggling with that concept all over the world. And it must be said, in Greek philosophical times, when those Greek philosophers started to push for this idea that knowledge is important, that reason and logic is important, that truth is important, even in those days, there was this movement against the Greek philosophers, and they were called the Sophists. Now, it was a school, the Sophists, uh, who sort of looked at philosophy as impractical, as pie in the sky, or theoretical, or whatever the case may be. And they suggested it's better for you as a human being to advance yourself by almost pretending to be knowledgeable, but for you to only have knowledge about that field that you go into. If you know more than that, then it's unnecessary. So they taught their students to be sophisticated, to appear to be sophisticated. Now, it must be said that even today, um, that is more uh, used in worldwide to appear to be sophisticated than to be actually knowledgeable about something. Um, uh, People want to only know about their particular field and nothing more really. At a later stage, you also had the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance was also a push in Europe by some people to get rid of the influence of the church, and they pushed for the truth and reason and logic, facts. Um, but then they developed also this counter um, movement that was later called the Romantic era. Now, what these people, the Romantics, believed is that uh, cold facts, reason and logic, that takes away from the spirit of the human being, and that the human being's spirit is actually more important than cold facts. So there was this movement against the Renaissance called the Romantic era. And once again, one must ask the question: who has won the day, the Romantics or the Renaissance people? And I have the suspicion it's the Romantics that's won the day. Now, some of the groups in the Romantic era, for instance, was a group um, of philosophers, which basically is more anti-philosophy, uh, who were called, or the philosophy, if one can call it a philosophy, it was called pragmatism. Now, pragmatism uh, had this argument that if something works, then it's true. If the idea of Santa Claus works, then it's true that Santa Claus exists. If the idea of God works in your society, then it's true that God exists. So that is what basically pragmatism means. Now, for me, uh, and that is what I find interesting. uh, as a newly sort of discovering philosophy and looking around at societies all over the world and thinking to myself, which societies are philosophical and which are not. And my personal view, it seems to me that very few countries, almost in the Scandinavian countries, they have still they still living under the influence of philosophy, and in other places not really. But one of the worst places, or more anti-philosophy places, if I can call it like that, is America. Now, pragmatism, uh, that is a form of philosophy which I don't think should be called philosophy, that took hold uh, in America. In America, there's this belief that uh, if it's your truth, then it's true. And Also, basically, this romantic notion that emotion is more important than reason. And so I believe that one can right now look around the world and look at which countries are successful and which countries are not so successful, which countries have issues. And I personally believe that America is one of the examples of where it's not going so well. Now, everybody sort of, my friends always criticize me because America is now this powerful, rich country, and therefore, they are the best, which is basically a similar sort of idea than pragmatism. If you're rich, you're successful, then that's good. I'm not sure. In America, where the truth is not even regarded as important, where reason is not important, where emotion is totally in control of everything. Everything is done on an emotional basis. Everything is done not because it is good for the society, but because it's entertaining. So I believe that pragmatism, which is anti-philosophical in my view, which has taken hold of in America, is actually a warning sign for the rest of the world to say to each other that, listen, uh, we should not stray too far away from the philosophical ideals as presented by the um, Greek philosophers, the classical Greek philosophers, the notion that truth is important, that knowledge is important, that reason and logic is important. We are at the stage in the world where philosophy is not regarded really in many places in the world, and in fact, many places in the world are completely anti-philosophical.